have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Mike Dukakis, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
I'm Jack Osborne, and you're listening.
This is Neptune Hamane, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I am your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, or demons, depending on who you speak to. We are broadcasting globally from different affiliates throughout the nation and the United Kingdom. As always, we bring to you a very special show, and today we also have a very special guest. And the cool thing is usually before a show, I could usually tell if that's the kind of guest that there's going to be so much material to cover that not only will the show fly by, that I instantly can tell that I know 2 hours is not going to cut it. That is the type of show we're going to have today. There are a lot of questions, of course, that I've always asked about our government agencies. We've had members from the FBI, specifically Eric O'Neill, who there was a movie made about him, if you recall, Breach, who he was the agent assigned to Robert Hansen, who was selling secrets to the Soviets and is labeled right now as the largest mole in the FBI's history. Currently serving right now Supermax, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Also, you've heard from the Defense Intelligence Agency, as well as the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agency. Well, today we bring Colonel Todd Halsey, formerly a supervisory special agent of the FBI, also worked with the CIA for a bit, and if he wasn't just about that, also he was an attorney for a time being. Like I said, so much incredible information we get to speak about, and I'd like to welcome our guest, Colonel Todd Halsey. Colonel, welcome to the show.
Dr. J, it's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you.
It's actually the pleasure to be speaking to you because just reading in your bio, there's so many great things that I was able to get just literally in the first paragraph that I knew that there was so much we were able to speak about. And then the greatest part was when I called you earlier today to ask you if there was anything outside of that purview that you would like to speak about. And then you plugged in something that we'll get into later in the show, which actually ties in the last show, which I really like that because now it's going to really work together of what's happening in our nation. But let me wind back the clock. Let's start essentially with a biography of you and how you essentially joined the FBI. What was your reasons for choosing the FBI as opposed to another agency? So I'm assuming this would take us back to your military career?
Well, I began my military career right after high school. I served a tour of active duty in the United States Marine Corps, and when my enlistment ended, I then went to college at Texas A&M University. I had always had an interest in military stuff, law enforcement stuff, a big interest in intelligence stuff, reading spy novels and things like that. So I always had that interest going back to childhood. And so I was kind of predestined to join the military, and then went to Texas A&M and trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do with my future. I decided I wanted to be a federal agent. Now, it's like a lot of people, and for me at the time, a federal agent, FBI, DEA, what's really the difference except for what they may do, at work day to day. And so I applied for several jobs in federal law enforcement, not the FBI, and I'll circle back to that in a moment. But I applied for several jobs, U.S. Marshal Service, DEA, and an agency that I wasn't really familiar with much was the United States Customs Service. And I applied to several agencies. Customs got back with me. I went through that process with Customs Service, and about 10 months after graduating from college, I was hired by the U.S. Customs Service as a criminal investigator.
Now, working with customs, one of the first thing that pops in people's minds is drug trafficking. Let me give you a really sad story. One of the waitresses at our family restaurant, her best friend, along with another friend, had gone to Tijuana, Mexico. Well, they're both American citizens, and the last day that they were supposed to come back, one of them didn't. Sure enough, the FBI gets involved. This becomes a huge mystery as to what happened to this young woman. They're able to track down some surveillance footage which showed her being kidnapped, possibly with chloroform or just something to prevent her from screaming. Days goes by when they find her at the border crossing, and what happened is they had used her as a mule, and they took out the majority of her organs. They had put her in the back seat between another couple, sunglasses on her, and said that she had been drunk from the night before, and sure enough, that she was literally used as a mule. And the reason I bring this up is because the first stop, the first protection people have with regards to becoming a mule, or for instance, bring in kilos of dangerous drugs, specifically one of the things, meth, that's being mass produced in Mexico, is people like yourself working at the border. So what were you using to combat trafficking then, and how has it evolved? Because now, I mean, there's tunnels. I know they're using drones, and I never thought they'd use dead humans, but apparently we're there.
Yeah, well, that's another thing about the Customs Service. Now, it does not exist anymore. On March 1st, 2003, the Department of Homeland Security was created, and the Customs Service was bifurcated and merged with the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And there are two agencies that exist now. One is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and the other is CBP, Customs and Border Protection. So the folks who work at the borders are inspectors. Now, they're CBP inspectors today. They were customs inspectors prior to March 1st, 2003, and they wear uniforms, and they're the front line of defense at America's borders, along with the Border Patrol, which patrols in between ports of entry. I was a investigator. I was a special agent, so I did the investigative work. Now, so I didn't do that job. When somebody drives up to California from Tijuana and they're sitting there in line of traffic to re-enter the United States, and they come up to the booth and somebody in a uniform says, "Hi, do you have anything to declare?" That is not the job that I had. The job I had would be if someone was found to be carrying contraband, for example, the inspectors would put that person in a cell, would segregate the vehicle with the evidence, and they'd call the customs special agents come down and then start working it as an investigative matter. And so I got in on the back end of that. But to answer your question about drug trafficking, I mean, the bottom line is the trafficking means, the smuggling methods are only limited by the human imagination, and that's it. So one of the ways that the cartels maximize their profits is to ensure that they shotgun across the border through various means their contraband product. I mean, you have it coming over in suitcases, you have it coming over inside people's bodies, you have it coming over in commercial airliners, you have it coming over people flying airplanes over clandestinely to carry narcotics, drones, as you mentioned. I mean, hot air balloons, tunnels. I mean, you can go down the list, and the reason they do that is because there's impossible to stop that much smuggling, that much trafficking across the border, especially when so many different methods are being used. I mean, they have people who've got backpacks or duffel bags, man packing narcotics into the United States. So, I mean, it runs the gamut from highly sophisticated smuggling techniques to some dude who was given, $200 American to carry these two heavy backpacks, across the border to meet some other dude in a pickup truck at a certain location. And I mean, and it's a constant thing. It never stops. It never ends. And that's why we have despite the war on drugs, since President Nixon declared it, there's as many or as much illicit narcotics on America's streets today as there ever was.
One of the things that apparently cartels do, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, don't they usually say, for instance, there's a dozen tractor trailers coming through, wouldn't they try to cast suspicion on one, load it with as many as kilos of whatever is going to get them arrested, so they could focus all the attention on that, pay that guy and tell him his family's going to have money for life, and have him be the guy that gets taken down and arrested so the other tractor trailers can get through?
Yes. That's an absolute valid technique, and one that has been known to be used over and over and over again. Quit.
I was just going to say, it's ironic. I mean, okay, I understand the money aspect for your family, but would you really give up your entire life for some, green dollar bills? I could never understand the people that'll say, "Yeah, I'll be the fall guy."
Well, because in Mexico, there's a phrase, "plomo o plata." You get, you can get the lead or you get the silver. So you say yes, and we'll pay you handsomely. You say no, we're going to kill you and your family. So it's not much of a choice. So you take the money and then take whatever lumps may come with it, because that is the main reason corruption, besides its toleration in Mexico, but is so endemic. Because if you're an honest cop in Mexico, and the local cartel or sub cartel wants you to do something for them, it may just be looking the other way. They give you that choice. Hey, look the other way, and we'll pay you this money. But if you don't, we'll simply kill you and your family, and in unpleasant ways on top of that. So that's how these fall guys are produced.
And it's actually sad, like you said, unpleasant ways. I think the bullet is one of the least amount of ways they use it now, as opposed to throwing someone in a vat of acid, for instance.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, and that can, you just use the ends of the human imagination, because cartels in Mexico are, depending on how much terror they want to inflict upon the population, they have used some very gruesome methods to kill people. Some of those methods taking a very long time, from beginning to end, to let other people know that they mean business.
Now, because of the cocaine rush from Colombia and I guess the northern side of the Andes from the late 70s through the 80s, I would assume that the Colombian cartel was the primary focus. Escobar's group, or the Godmother, Griselda Blanco's group in the 80s. But hasn't it shifted so people can honestly say the biggest drug cartels that people need to worry about in North America are in Mexico as opposed to the Colombian cartel?
That is correct. And what happened is that when the Colombian cartels, when the cocaine trafficking trade began in earnest in the 1970s, and the Colombian cartels were founded and started to grow and became very powerful, they had to pay transportation networks to get the product from the Andes area, from Colombia, up into its biggest market, the United States. So they would pay, Mexicans to move the product in Mexico. It would come up from Colombia to a destination, and then the Mexicans would take it, across the border, and then it would be, deposited with somebody who was part of the Colombian cartel's distribution network. But after doing that for, 10, 15, 20 years, the Mexicans, they decided that, it was staring them in the face, this opportunity. And they basically told the Colombians, we're going to take over. What we're going to do is buy the product from you, and we'll take it from here, because you can't get it past us if we don't move it for you. And if you try to strong arm us, then we'll kill every one of you that are in Mexico. So we're just going to have this relationship in which the Colombian cartels are simply a supplier of product, and the Mexican cartels take it from there. And because, let's be honest, 25% of the 25% of the population of Mexico does not live in Mexico. It lives in the United States. And what that means is there is an instant network of people who can move this product on this side who are loyal to Mexico, loyal to Mexican cartels. It may be a loyalty that is simply bought off, but nonetheless, the Mexicans took over the drug trade. The Colombian cartels today are just a supplier. They're the manufacturer of a product, and once it leaves Colombia, the Mexicans, they carry it, they smuggle it, and they distribute it in the United States, and they are some of the most powerful drug cartels on planet Earth.
And what I see, at least on the news, is it seems to be more vicious, or I don't know if it's more vicious rather than it is just more cartels in Mexico fighting amongst each other. Because it seemed like when it was just one group or one organization in Colombia, they sort of had a stronghold on it. But yet now, as you said, with the shift where the Colombians used to have the Mexicans working for them, and there seems to be a vital role shift where the Colombians are now being told what to do, rather than dealing with one group of Mexicans, you have the different cartels who are fighting each other. Isn't that the case as well?
That's true, but that's not a problem for the Colombians because they're going to sell it to whomever will buy it.
Anyone who's got the money, essentially.
Yeah, and has the established contacts. They're going to sell it to whomever will buy it, and once it's sold and the product leaves Colombia, Colombian cartels really don't care. They've done their job at that point. The
That's
Mexicans,
true.
The violence in Mexico is because of the cartels fighting each other, and they're fighting each other for territory, and the fighting's been very vicious.
It has been. There was a very sad documentary called Cartel Land where it essentially followed a group called the Auto Defenses, who were basically community elders in a small town who decided to get together and fight the cartel, specifically the Knights Templar cartel. And what you see throughout this documentary is that group becomes so large, they become a cartel. And within that cartel, they break off and become three more. And essentially, you have one group that started to end the violence becomes perpetrators of the violence. So it's like the cycle never really ends. Let me ask you about El Chapo real quick. He was arrested. Tunnels were dug for him to escape Mexican prisons or jails twice. Now, if he gets convicted and sent to Supermax, assuming there's no tunnel dug out there, I don't think he'll ever make it out of Supermax. But hypothetically, wherever he's sitting now, do you think I think anything is possible, but do you think that people that are loyal to him would be stupid enough to where they would say dedicate, 50 to 150 people whose whole life or mission would be from now until they get him free to essentially declare war on the U.S. in essence of causing crimes to get people in more fear, or eventually getting to the point of trying to break him out, willingly throwing themselves at the law?
In my opinion, no. Because, and this is from my own experience, but it's just my opinion, is that they have already written El Chapo off. He's in U.S. custody, and they've written him off. And all of the players in his organization who have been jockeying for power have already obtained their own franchises and their own fiefdoms, and basically bringing Chapo back to Mexico would just derail all of that.
That's actually.
I think what's going to happen is that his organization will take care of his family in Mexico, but by continuing to provide a high income to them, so they may live as they're accustomed to. But now that he's gone, American justice, for all of its the chinks in its armor most recently, American justice is something that criminals around the world fear more than anything else, because once you're in the system, this assumes a conviction, and everybody's innocent until proven guilty. So this assumes a conviction, But once he's convicted and sent to Supermax, he's gone. So I think they've rearranged their organizational operations, taking into account that Chapo's gone. He may be calling some shots from jail, but probably not that many. But you have to remember there's so much money involved in the trafficking, international narcotics trafficking, and the other businesses that the cartels are in, that having Chapo out of the way has allowed the underlings to become their own petty kings.
I'm actually glad you brought this viewpoint up, because that's something I haven't paid much attention to or even thought about, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, people that you mentioned that are always vying for the power underneath, they overthrow their bosses all the time. I mean, if they all get caught, the people snitch so easily. I wouldn't think that it's hard not to assume, like you said, that people wouldn't have already written him off. The people who are waiting for him to maybe get assassinated so they can become the boss are probably been acting as such since he's been arrested. You also brought up another point that is something that we definitely need to talk about, is the fear of the United States prisons. People in Latin America, despite how horrible their prisons are, a lot of them would rather be killed viciously at that than get caught to do any time in the United States. And that's not just something you hear from south of the border. You hear this even in Europe. I don't know about Russia or the Philippines, but you did mention one of the reasons is once you're essentially in the system, it's hard for you to ever be any different, especially if you're sentenced to somewhere with life without parole. But given the fact that United States spends so much money to house people, make sure they have a nutritious diet, wouldn't you think that some of the people would not fear the United States prisons as much and would actually look at it as like, oh, retirement home in some sense?
I don't think so, because at the bottom line, prison is prison.
Sure.
But American justice, I mean, we're really an unusual country, I think. We are our own worst critics. And if you talk to the man on the street interview, everything is going to hell in a handbasket. But if you interviewed a different man on the street 50 years ago, would have said the same thing. 50 years from now, we'll say the same thing. But we really don't have a system. Well, our system is designed, and we have people who are committed to it, that a person like El Chapo can't just bribe their way out of prison. They can't bribe their way out of a life sentence. They can't jury intimidate somebody into an acquittal. I don't care who they are. The justice system is not amateurish at dealing with arch criminals. I mean, how many arch criminals do we have to list who have died in the United States prisons, whether they're American arch criminals or foreign arch criminals? Simply the fact is that they know that if they're arrested and convicted and they're sentenced to a long prison term, that it's going to be a long prison term. I mean, there's no parole in the federal system, for example. So if you're sentenced to 20 years, you're going to do just about 20 years. There is a formula for time off for good behavior, but there's no parole. So you have to do your entire sentence, minus whatever good behavior points you get. And I mean, El Chapo might be, in a Mexican prison, might be treated with great deference by fellow prisoners, and El Chapo in a United States prison, he just might get his ass kicked by another inmate who doesn't care who he is. I mean, that's a difference, because even American cons in prison, there are prison gangs and prison organizations. I'm not talking about that, but when John Gotti went to prison, for example, John Gotti,
yes,
head of the Gambino crime family, he got beaten up in prison.
He did, and
that's
what I was thinking. Actually, yeah, you're absolutely right. Him, that was the name I was thinking when you were talking about, the criminals, the arch nemesis.
So in other words, this guy, head of the Gambino crime family, goes to prison, and another inmate, beats the crap out of him. And of course, Gotti's not a snitch, so he just said, hey, it was nothing. I slipped and fell and got this black eye. But the El Chapo's not going to get deferred to by these prisoners, his fellow prisoners. And so that's what the foreign criminals know what's in store for them. They go to an American prison and they get convicted. They get a long prison sentence. They're going to be there for almost that entire sentence. And if no good behavior for the entire sentence, and the other prisoners don't give a damn who they are and will treat them just like, hey, you're just another prisoner.
Especially today.
And that is way different than other countries.
You're absolutely right, but I think more so, especially today with Supermax or ADX in Florence, Colorado, because even though during John Gotti's time, as you mentioned, when he did, get pummeled by other inmates, and you even see a video with him talking to his son, John Gotti Jr., where he finally sort of realizes he's in there for life and he's never going to wield the same power as he did before. But even at that point, Leavenworth, as at the time called the Supermax of the United States federal prison system, was nothing compared to what the former warden of Florence, Colorado, ADX, calls this cleaner version of hell. So whatever privileges they would get in Leavenworth, I would think they're so isolated, one phone call per month. And the fact that people can't even get near ADX Colorado, the closest we could see is what Blueprints. So I couldn't even imagine an hour there or what El Chapo's life would consist of. But I would think that the influence he would have from behind the walls of Supermax would be minimal, if nothing at all.
I agree.
Now, so after you were in the customs, which you did make clear you weren't one of the people who was just the preliminary people who would stop it, you were the actual investigator. You would you interrogate someone and try to get to the bigger fish. You were, essentially the guy behind the scenes doing the work. Am I right?
Right.
So at what point did you finish or how many years were you in customs before you joined the FBI?
5 years.
And was it the same process? You just decided it was time for a change in federal law enforcement and you decided for the FBI? Because a lot of people think they want to join the CIA because they think that's where all the cool spy stuff is, but they forget a very basic principle, which I know you clearly know about this, which is that the CIA cannot operate on United States soil without a domestic agency attached. So really a lot of the action would be on U.S. soil, would be in the FBI, right?
That's right. Well, I actually quit the Customs Service to go back to school. I took a master's degree in international relations and a law degree in law school, and passed the bar and practiced law for about a year. And I really missed putting the puzzle together, putting facts together to build a case. Mm-hmm. And I contacted the Customs Service about going back, and the people I contacted, in all honesty, couldn't have been more bothered. So I thought, well, what agency hires lawyers to be agents? Well, the FBI. So I applied to the FBI, and because of my prior federal law enforcement experience and the fact that I was a lawyer, I mean, and a military veteran, I had a lot of things going for me that were in my favor. So 14 months after applying, I was reporting for duty at Quantico at the FBI Academy, which is a really short period of time. It's usually 18 to 24 months in normal hiring process. So it took me 14 months to get through the process and then report for duty at Quantico.
Can you tell us the difference between an agent and a special agent?
Well, agent is shorthand for special agent. I mean, special agent is a legal term. There's a theory of law called the agency theory of law. Everybody is familiar with a real estate agent, a talent agent, a sports agent. Well, an agent is somebody a person like if you're selling or buying a house, you contract with a real estate agent to be your legal representative for the purpose of this proposed transaction. Well, in the government, you have people who have general agency authority, can represent the government and do anything. In other words, the President of the United States can make treaties, sign contracts, spend money, all of these things. If you have a limited set of authorities to act under, and it's usually a term used exclusively in law enforcement, you're a special agent, meaning you're an agent of the United States with special authority to conduct certain activities on its behalf. So it's a legal term. That's where that term, the title special agent, comes from. It's a legal term.
Interesting. Yes.
Offhandedly, people would call a special agent an agent.
So it's interchangeable, essentially, what you basically said. So anyone who works for the FBI is automatically an agent and hence a special agent. If you're an FBI agent, you're a special agent. But of course, there's about 13,000 FBI special agents. There's 35,000 FBI employees. So you have 22,000 employees who are not agents at all. For instance, one thing we'll get later on into is like Lisa Page. She wasn't an agent. She was an FBI attorney, correct?
Right.
Got you. Okay, now, when you were working for the FBI, I'm sure you heard at the beginning, one of the guests I've had on the past was Eric O'Neill. I would assume you were working at the FBI at the time Robert Hansen was taken down?
I believe the Hansen arrest happened just before I entered on duty with the FBI. It might have happened in the first several months. I simply don't remember. I'd have to look it up. But yeah, Hansen, I worked with people who knew Bob Hansen.
Wow.
I worked with a lot of people who knew Bob Hansen personally.
So here's my question.
So, yeah.
Even say near the end of your FBI career, you're talking years later, 21 years you were in the FBI. So let's assume you're in your last couple of years. When people referred to Bob Hansen, was that still the largest case as far as someone being a mole within the FBI, or was it just one of the largest cases ever, even comparable to Osama bin Laden?
Well, I would have to say that would be apples and oranges, but in terms of being a mole, Hansen was. You have to look at Aldrich Ames at CIA,
yes,
and Robert Hansen at FBI, of being the two most damaging moles inside the United States government who worked for the Soviet Union, and of course later a little bit for Hansen, the Russian Federation. But yeah, those were the highest placed moles that the Soviets recruited in our government.
You just mentioned the Russia Federation. Here's a question that someone asked me to ask you, which I guess a lot of people have this question, which is kind of very basic and a little bit on the comedy side, even though none of this matter is at all comical. When people are required to register as a foreign agent, for instance, if you're in the FSB, you come to the United States, do people really register as belonging to foreign secret services or intelligence agencies? I would just think that would be opposite of their entire mission of coming to spy on behalf of their country in the United States.
Well, actually, the legal requirement, it really applies to Americans who are doing work on behalf of a foreign government. It's not really a requirement that a foreign official register, and they don't. And in the intelligence business, you're going to have intelligence service officers who are under diplomatic cover, so they're credentialed to the State Department as diplomats, and so their day job might appear to be the third assistant secretary in charge of paper clips at such and such embassy, but their real job is to spy. So no, people who are credentialed to an embassy, even not as a diplomat but as an employee of an embassy, don't register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. That really is for people who countries hire lobbying firms on K Street in Washington to lobby Congress on their behalf. Well, that lobbying firm the individuals who are doing the work have to register as a foreign agent representing, Estonia or something. So it can be tracked, not authorized and then, licensed and then tracked to determine who is actually representing a foreign country. But, spies, no, they would, even if it were required, they wouldn't.
Because they would be opposite of what they're trying to do, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, when you worked for the FBI, you've done a lot of things, but I see here for a time you were at the LA division, right there on Wilshire at the Federal Center, right?
I was in Los Angeles for 5 long years. Yes.
Yeah, I'm very well with that center. My brother works there right now in the same building you were in. Nonetheless, let's talk about intelligence and counterintelligence. Since we are no longer in an industrial era fundamentally, and we're literally in a technological era, I would think that the intelligence as a whole has changed drastically. And one of the things that is somewhat to our disadvantage sometimes is technology, especially when dealing with countries or actors that are not using technology. So, for instance, one of the ways is we were looking for Osama bin Laden before he was killed in Pakistan was we were trying to get his courier cell phone or track it, hoping it was on. But wasn't one of the reasons we weren't able to track him was because he wasn't using technology. He wasn't sending emails. He was literally having people ride on a scooter or run and tell, person A to tell person B a secret or to tell person C and so on and so forth. So you could have all the drones and all the interception that money can buy, but it's not intercepting anything if it's going from one mouth to one ear. So in that sense, wouldn't you have to sort of rewrite the book on how you conduct surveillance and intelligence and counterintelligence?
Well, I think what you just described, Dr. J, is old school tradecraft. And
yes.
I think one of the things that everyone needs to be mindful of if they have an interest in, espionage, tradecraft, intelligence operations, and that includes the people who are actually doing it, is that it's not to get wrapped up that technology is the end-all, be-all. Because I will testify on your show that old-school tradecraft is still used by foreign intelligence services today and is still used by our own because of that very reason. Because one of the quickest ways to have an operation interdicted is by the use of technology. That doesn't mean technology isn't also leveraged in multiple ways, both to support an intelligence operation and to counter an intelligence operation, because it is. But old school tradecraft, they call spying, the great they, the big they. It's said that spying is the world's oldest profession, and of course the world's second oldest profession is we know what that is.
Yeah.
The world's oldest profession is spying, and good old-fashioned tradecraft works if an intelligence officer or an agent or co-optee uses their cell phone, more than just for, say, simply personal matters, but uses it operationally, it can be easily tracked. It can be tapped. It can be, a lot of things. I mean, most of your smartphones, and I'm not a technical intelligence guy. I'm a human intelligence guy.
Mm-hmm.
But I can tell you that your computer sitting at home has a camera in it. I don't know if they sell any that don't have a camera in them. You have smartphones. Well, all of these things can be turned on remotely without its owner/user even knowing. And it can be used as a listening device. It can be used as a video device. The technology exists to be able to reach into somebody's smartphone and turn it on without them knowing it, and then listen through it. The technology does exist. So the technology has, just as it has commercially, it has changed the way business is done, and it has created tremendous challenges in trying to stop foreign intelligence services. And, and of course, what a foreign intelligence service is doing, our intelligence services are doing as well. But it's not only enabled different kinds of operations, the use of different kinds of clandestine electronic communications, but it also provides a whole series of vulnerabilities that you don't have if you're doing dead drops in the middle of the woods. And so intelligence services still use dead drops in the middle of the woods, and you still have to physically surveil suspected spies to determine their routine and where they're going and who they're meeting and et cetera, et cetera. You cannot just rely on wiretapping a cell phone. But that's another entree into an operation. But because of the sophisticated technology that's out there, you can send messages via email that appear to be, somebody were to look, and I mean even look forensically. It may be, "Hi, Mom, I'm doing great. Hope you are too. Say hi to the family." And what's really underlying that is within that message could be the actual message, and it's going to headquarters back in whichever country the person happens to be working for. And it's really hard to dig down, even forensically, to find that embedded message, but exists. But again, then it also can enable great communications back to the home country. It's also a whole slate of vulnerabilities.
That actually reminds me of Sir Francis Bacon and the bilateral code he made, where you write one letter in cursive and one letter in block, and it literally turns out to be a whole different library of words that, just as you mentioned, it may be something as generic as, "Oh, hi, my dorm is looking great at college. UCLA is, fun, and there's I'm going to eat sushi tomorrow," and underneath it's like, "Okay, kill so-and-so," or something like that. And another thing you also mentioned is the idea or the technology of turning on, and you brought up a fact. No, not a single modern PC, laptop, or anything does not have a camera or microphone in it, and obviously smartphones have to have a microphone, otherwise they wouldn't be phones. But back in 2007, when David Petraeus was acting director of the CIA, he had a statement released that says, in other words, "We now have the capability to turn on your microphone or camera on your laptop." This is before before iPhones started branching out into other phones, remotely without the owners knowing it was on. If that was said publicly, 2007, I was always questioning what else can really be done, because it seems whatever's released, we're sort of 10 years, if not further down the line, ahead of said technology. And also, when you talked about the old school spycraft or tradecraft, that would make sense that it's obviously the oldest profession, because how else would you have coups that would have taken down, say, ancient civilizations from, say, Alexander the Great when he was invading all the way to Afghanistan? You would rely on spies to find weaknesses in your enemies. So you have tradecrafts that have stood the test of time that, like you said, with dead drops, they're still happening, because sometimes this is the only way you can be 100% sure, especially when you have technology that has so many weaknesses in it. One of the things you did for the FBI, or might have this been when you worked for the CIA for a bit as an FBI agent, was you were in the Weapons of Mass Destruction's Directorate. Can you talk about that for a bit? What exactly does that entail?
Well, the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate at the FBI was concerned with nation-state proliferation of WMD. And, the FBI has a counterterrorism division. It was concerned with the terrorist use of WMD, but the WMD Directorate at FBI headquarters concerned itself with nation-state proliferation. So you think about North Korea, Iran, Pakistan. Pakistan's already a nuclear power, of course, but how those countries proliferated nuclear weapons technology, and that also includes delivery systems, ICBMs, SLBMs, et cetera, and it also concerned itself with that seam between a foreign power and a terrorist organization that might be paid or co-opted by a foreign power to carry out the WMD attack of some kind on behalf of the foreign policy of the foreign country. And so I worked as the WMD directorate in the FBI, and I did that for several years.
Were you ever working in a foreign country, literally on hands, as opposed to doing your work from Quantico or around the U.S.? Were you ever assigned somewhere for a period of time outside the U.S.?
On a temporary assignment, I was the assistant legal attaché for international terrorism at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Wow. Now,
so that was an assignment on the ground, yeah.
Now, because Osama bin Laden is from Saudi Arabia, yet that's one of our strongest allies as far as our United States government is concerned, what were you able to see as far as what's happening on the ground with, say, for instance, terrorism, or how they viewed Western civilization? I mean, are they declaring jihad down in Saudi Arabia as they would be in other strongholds of ISIS? Well,
you can imagine that region of the world is a complicated mess.
Yeah.
The House of Saud took over Arabia, and it became known as Saudi Arabia. Very early on, the original Saudi king knew. I mean, guys are not. He's a very sophisticated man taking over a country, declaring it in his own, titling it in his own family name, knowing the vast petroleum resources that exist in Saudi Arabia, knew that the future was to align itself with Great Britain and the United States. And in return for providing petroleum, resources for both British Petroleum and the American petroleum companies to move in, to drill, to mine for the hydrocarbons that are in the ground, and then sell them on the global market, paying, of course, the Saudis for all of these efforts, that the protection by the United States and Great Britain, of course, remember, Britain was a much bigger power back in the 1930s and 40s than it is today.
Pre-World War II, right?
Pre-World War II and during World War II. It was really, when the empire came apart after World War II, that Britain, lost its power in terms of being the big player on planet Earth, because it was supplanted by the United States in that role also at the same time. But, the Saudi king knew, I have to align myself with the Brits and the Americans, and they will protect me and my regime. And you've heard the term petrodollars. Well,
yes.
Petrodollar is a term that's derived from the fact that the Saudis will not sell petroleum, will not sell oil, except in the currency of American dollars. So that's where the petrodollar came from. So not only did the Saudis secure American protection, but they secured the protection of the American dollar. The dollar is the stablest currency on planet Earth. It is a currency that you not only go to 7-Eleven and plop down, your $2 for your big gulp or whatever it costs now, but it's also a commodity traded on international monetary markets. So Saudi's relationship with the United States is very close, but the relationship is the Saudi family and the Saudi regime being having a relationship with the United States. That is very different than the average Saudi on the street and his or her feelings about the United States. So I can tell you that, having been on the ground there, that we work very, very well and closely with the Saudi government. But when we were, out in town away from the diplomatic quarter, you could sense the hostility and the dislike. In fact, there's a little story. We were riding in an embassy vehicle. You know, it's an FBI vehicle at the embassy, so it's armored and everything, but it has the diplomatic plates. And this very nice Mercedes passed us, four young men, looked like they were in their early to mid 20s. And as they passed us, we're in the center lane on a highway in Riyadh. They're in the left-hand lane, and four hands, one out of each window, came up, giving us the number one salute. So how the average Saudi thinks of the United States versus what the Saudi royal family and regime has to think of the United States are not necessarily the same thing. And so in terms of, jihad and things like that, I think that it wasn't until 2011 when a suicide bomber tried to assassinate the interior minister, whose name escapes me right now, but a prince of the royal family, and of course the suicide bomber succeeded in committing suicide. But in the weird way that explosives physics work, the Ministry of the Interior next to him was not really hurt that bad. But I think it was a wake-up call for the royal family that this the fundamentalist jihad is bad for us too, and they really took steps to crack down on it.
I would think that the difference between the average Saudi citizen and the royal family comes down to one word: money. I would think that those who get to enjoy the spoils of their oil that they're sitting over the sea of oil that they have there, versus the people who really don't get any of that, this probably makes a big difference in how they view us. Here's a quick question before we go on to break. This is just a theory, of course, with Colonel Gaddafi, of one of the reasons why he was killed. It was, some people state that right before the uprising in Libya, that Gaddafi wanted to switch the standard of oil from the petrodollar to an African gold coin, whether it be a Libyan coin or from Iraq or just in general something in Africa tied to their gold. Do you know if that has any merit, or have you heard anything with regards to wanting to switch off the American dollar and into gold?
Specifically, that doesn't ring a bell with me. I will say that Gaddafi was not a big enough player on the global petroleum market, in my opinion, to have been able to advance that idea very far. And as far as that's why he was dethroned and killed, I think there are a lot better reasons than that. Both locally and in terms of regional politics, with having that happen than that. I mean, he was not the only person, and there's certainly been many since who have wanted to see the American dollar be toppled from its position as the reserve currency of planet Earth. Which I'll just say tangentially, if that ever happens, that you and I and everybody listening to this as Americans are screwed. That's probably a whole nother show. But right now, we're the world's reserve currency, and that's a great thing. I don't think Gaddafi was big enough to have disturbed
to sway. Yeah. I mean, you're right. He is a small player. Libya is not the largest supplier of oil to us, and I'm glad you mentioned that statement. That if it was to happen, that we were no longer the reserve money of the entire world, it would affect us from several different ways. I mean, for one, we would no longer be the wealthiest nation on this earth. If we had another monetary system that was tied to the petroleum, then you have so many other factors to deal with. For instance, the conversion rate and the fluctuating conversion rates. And therefore, if you have, say, for instance, it based on Russia's money or something else, then they would essentially have more control as to what our dollar meant globally. And I guess one of the reasons why it's so strong is because of the fact that it is tied into the oil. Okay, I'm afraid to go into a large topic before we're going to go into break. So let me just ask you a quick question. This is off topics, but something that you may at least know about, because I know a lot of people are going to be upset if I don't ask about this. Were you able to see back about 9 months ago that the DoD released some footage of three different videos shot by pilots of unidentified aerial phenomenon, also known as unidentified flying objects, where you had two of them, I believe, Navy pilots, and the third, I don't know if it was a NASA pilot, but this is the first time that the Department of Defense has actually released something where you have the pilots in there talking about what they're seeing and how it seems to be defying the laws of physics, not making any conclusions of what it is other than to say it's strange. Do you recall that footage?
I have seen that footage, yes.
What do you think about that? Because, when I started to see that on Tucker Carlson and other mainstream media, I realized that that was probably one of the more important times of the government, whether it be American or Mexican government, anybody releasing something like that for the public to view.
I think it was interesting, just the news story itself, because as I recall, there were two Navy F-18s that were off the coast of San Diego practicing with one another, and they were asked by their controller. I believe there was a carrier that was offshore, and that's where they actually launched from. But they were asked by their controller if they were, no, it wasn't the carrier. But anyway, they were asked if they were carrying weapons, which was an odd question. And they said that they were not carrying live weapons, but inert practice weapons, and they were vectored to intercept this radar anomaly, and then proceeded to follow it and shoot, footage of it. And it's very interesting. I mean, I'm a pilot, not a fighter pilot, but I'm a pilot, and that kind of stuff, fascinates me. Don't know what it was or could be, but it was very fascinating, and I do recall the story.
That is definitely the biggest mystery of them all, is what it is, and especially the fact that it's not shaped as anything aerodynamic. You're a pilot. I'm a skydiver, so although I don't know everything that you would know, clearly I've spent a lot of time on airplanes, and I could clearly see if there's nothing with wings, then how is it creating the lift that we're all very familiar with that. But that, again, is something that could literally take up an entire other show. Real quick, let me just double check here what time we have until the break. And in the meantime, I'm going to go and ask you a little bit more about your time at the FBI. Now, I'm assuming you joined after Theodore Kaczynski was arrested?
Yes.
Were you, even throughout your whole tenure at the FBI, were people still talking about the fact that that was the longest running case, or the fugitive that took up the most time to be found and arrested? And what the FBI had to learn afterwards when approaching cases. Thankfully, there hasn't been a case like that since, but I would think that would have changed things internally.
Well, for people who didn't work on the Kaczynski case, there's not a lot of water cooler talk about what happened in some other division, which I believe San Francisco division was the main division, was the Office of Origin on the case. So I really don't know. People in the FBI don't stand around talking about cases that they haven't worked on.
Yeah.
Cases don't affect the area that they're currently assigned to. But to answer the question about lessons, I mean, the FBI has said publicly, and certainly in training, is that the reason Ted Kaczynski got caught is because the FBI decided to go ahead and publicize his manifesto, to have it published.
And if it wasn't released, his brother wouldn't have read it, right? That's what came down to it, right?
Exactly right. That's what it came down to. And his brother said, "This sounds a lot like Ted," and called the FBI, and then Ted Kaczynski eventually is arrested. And then, of course, the forensic evidence and everything in that little shack is like, "Yep, here's the dude." and so what it taught the FBI is not to sit on material like that for as long as it did in that case, but to get it out to the public, because, the FBI, and sometimes just for the sake of the audience, let me say, if I refer to the FBI as we, that's only out of long-term habit. I am a retired FBI special agent, and I don't work for the FBI anymore. So if I say we, it's merely a slip. So I try to say they, but the FBI,
Well, usually law enforcement is a family. I know this because also you have my father, who's a part of law enforcement, and even being retired for a few decades, he still refers to the police force that he was a part of as we. So that's definitely understandable. And of course, that's why I refer to you as Colonel as opposed to Agent on the show. But of course, it's important to talk about that you were, because although I've talked to Eric O'Neill and he was a young agent, it wasn't too long after he was hired that he was assigned to work with Hansen. He pretty much retired after that. So to know much about the FBI from him was really not much there. We were able to talk specifically about that time he was there. He's since gone on to be a motivational speaker and other things. But I think his ordeal with Bob Hansen scared him to the point that I could only imagine what that would do to someone. And he definitely talked about some scenes that were in the movie that reflected what actually happened. For instance, when he was putting that PDA in the pocket of Hansen's briefcase and then immediately changed his mind. He said that when he was on the set of that, he was literally shaking, and one of the producers pointed that out to him. Okay, since I see we're not taking a break, I'm just going to continue and asking you about your time in the FBI. Let's talk about East Asian counterintelligence. When I hear East Asia, I'm thinking of Vietnam, Laos, or are you talking about, say, for instance, China, North Korea? What exactly were you involved in when you were dealing East Asian counterintelligence?
Yeah, East Asia refers to China and the Korean Peninsula primarily.
Gotcha.
And
okay.
In the Los Angeles division, the squad that I was assigned to, the counterintelligence squad that I was assigned to, was focused on North Korea.
Now, do you think this is pure opinion? We all saw what happened in Singapore, but at the same time, not too long after Singapore, we have our Secretary of State go to North Korea, and as he's leaving, you have the North Korea government, people that are close to Kim Jong-un, but not him per se, that called us gangsterish in our ways. And so the question becomes, will that meeting end up leading to denuclearization in North Korea, or is it sort of going to be another empty promise? And again, this is just based on your experience at the time dealing with counterintelligence in that region and promises made and broken from the DPRK in the past.
I'm a pessimist on the issue, but I'm going to tell you that our current president, being as unconventional as he is, love him, hate him, support him, want to see him impeached, it doesn't matter. But an honest assessment of the things that he has set himself as president to accomplish, that it's just like ding, accomplished, ding, accomplished, ding, accomplished. And I wouldn't write off an accomplishment in this arena, but I remain pessimistic that the North Korean regime will actually give up its nuclear weapons, at the end of the day. But with such an unconventional commander-in-chief, he may do it just because he may get it done just simply because Kim Jong-un he won't be able to deal with him in the same way presidents have been dealt with in the past. I mean, they basically bribed the Clinton administration to give them a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of technology, And, the pronouncements from the Clinton administration that, basically like Neville Chamberlain, peace in our time, everything's great in Korea. Turns out, none of it was. It was just a scam that they ran on the Clinton administration. Not that the Bush administration had its hands full with other things in other parts of the world. But,
not too far, even though.
Did much better.
Yeah,
but did any better? And then, of course, I don't think the Obama administration was tough in terms of foreign policy at all. And now we got a guy who's tough. He doesn't care what people think, and he doesn't care that people. You call him a name, he'll tweet out. He'll call somebody a name back, and he's bombastic. But how do you deal with this guy if you're a foreign leader, especially if you're an adversarial foreign leader? And Donald Trump, as President of the United States, has basically said in so many tweets, he has basically said, "Yeah, just try us, buddy, and we'll kick your ass." He's basically said that in a collection of tweets. And who's to say? You can say that if Obama had said that, or W had said that, or Bill Clinton had said that the person in Pyongyang would go, "Oh yeah, okay, fine, I get it. This is rhetoric." With Donald Trump, how do they know? I mean, how do they know? They don't know. So he may pull it off, but I remain pessimistic that North Korea will denuclearize in the end.
But staying pessimistic is also healthy, because to just assume that they will is obviously another statement. And I'm glad you brought up Obama's relationship with North Korea, because it's been stated that when Kim Jong-un did meet Donald Trump, that he would have never met Obama. Apparently, Obama tried to reach out for him for talks, and it was just a flat-out no. And I would also think is, as you mentioned, is you have a president right now that really has no precedent as far as what he will do. He has flexed his muscle, like you said, where, tries will destroy you. He's even done it recently to Iran. But I would also think is, from a business standpoint, if you have this president who's actually willing to have talks, and if he did play that video for Kim Jong-un, which essentially showed nuclear proliferation or building of cities and having factories and a better quality of life, and then you see the Trump Tower and Trump hotels, and you're like, whoa, hold on a second. When this guy's done being president, he's going to go back to being one of the, preeminent builders across the world. So in hindsight, I would think that one of the things Kim Jong-un was considering is maybe a Trump hotel in Pyongyang. I mean, that's not too far-fetched if relations stay on the positive path. If China doesn't interfere with North Korea, because I would think that China's whispering to their ear, don't give up your only defense, which would be the nuclear weapons.
Well, I'm not sure China has a lot of control over North Korea when it comes to nuclear weapons. I'm not really sure that they do, because China, as a nuclear power and as a major economic player on planet Earth, has to worry about whether North Korea is going to basically, ruin the party by blowing a device off on the peninsula or somewhere else. China doesn't need the headache. So I'm not really sure. And that in official North Korean press, I think it was a year ago, maybe a little bit long. It was about a year ago. They criticized the North Korean press, which is the official voice of the North Korean government, criticized China and its leaders, and which is very telling. So I think China wants to manage North Korea, but they don't want North Korea to do anything stupid that's going to ruin the regional economy or maybe the global economy, because China is really a very poor nation. You go to Shanghai, it is a booming city, but if you go out in the hinterlands, people are dirt poor. They kind of they have a lot of social problems that we don't see. We don't see a lot of things reported in our news media, but there's 2 Chinese males for every Chinese female. Now I don't know. I don't know about you, but can you see that there's some social dislocation that will happen in that country? How many 20-year-olds you need to have who can't get a girlfriend simply because there aren't any girls before they get angry and start to, be a problem domestically?
And then you have an instant army of all these, unmarried, single, angry males at that. too, I would think.
Well,
You know,
well, it could be an instant army turned inward.
Yeah, instant coup.
Due to that one-child policy. Yeah, I mean, so China's not with. Look, every society has its problems, and China is not perfect either. And we just don't think about. We've turned inward on ourselves so much, and everything is 24/7 politics in this country now. I mean, you can't even go to a doggone NFL football game without some jackwagon making $8 million a year not standing for the national anthem. Screw that guy, and screw everyone. And anyway, but we can't even get away from it going to watch a pro game.
Yeah, you can't go anywhere. Yeah, that's true.
But we forget because of that. Other countries have their internal problems that we don't know about, and that's a big one for China. It is grossly poverty-stricken, and due to its one-child policy and its primary wanting people to make boys, they have an inverted society in terms of the gender demographic. You got a bunch of young men who will never get a girlfriend, much less ever get a wife. It's going to because of governmental policies, and there's other things. So they don't want Kim Jong-un or whoever succeeds him to light one of those big bombs off on the peninsula or somewhere else, because it's going to be, like I said before, a headache they don't need and they don't want.
Especially, as you mentioned, since they have so many of their problems that aren't really talked about here in the West. I mean, sure, a lot of people hear about their massive smog problem, but truthfully for me, it wasn't until there was the Beijing Olympics where they literally had to clear out cars, say, okay, those of you who have a license plate that ends in so-and-so can drive every other day of the week. It took a literal month, for any sort of the cloud to be lifted from Beijing, and I believe they didn't even allow their own citizens to drive within the 2 weeks of the Olympics that it was being held, and a few days before and a few days after that full month of on and off driving. So that's just one of the problems that we didn't see here or was vaguely talked about. And then, like you mentioned, this one-child policy. I remember when I was hearing about it, and I was wondering, I wonder what would happen. You have one child, and yet that one child 20 years later dies in this accident. All of a sudden, because of laws in the government, you can't have any more children, or it's too late for you. What would you do? And yet that's just one part of the problem. But really, when you think about it, that really isn't quite a problem, as it is having the disproportionate number of men to women, and the fact that they are an instant army. Here's a topic that I was saving for towards the end of the show, which we could talk about now, and then, of course, come back to what else you did during your career. Spygate. Let's talk about Spygate for a little bit, because of the fact of we just finished with Dr. Jerome Corsi the other night talking about killing the deep state. And what I've started to realize by paying attention to the news and trying to put piece by piece together is that there was some collusion with the United States and the United Kingdom to essentially rig the elections for Hillary Clinton. And if it wasn't for the disgraced MI6 agent Christopher Steele corroborating whatever Fusion GPS figured out, or whatever so-called facts they had on Trump in order to get that warrant on Carter Page to spy on Donald Trump within his organization during the 2016 elections, and then pinning it on Russia is what the evidence seems to point to now. So when you finished working for the FBI, James Comey was the director. Am I right?
Yes.
And Andrew McCabe was his number two at the time you also finished, correct?
No, I don't think Andrew McCabe was the deputy. I don't remember who was. I don't remember who was. I'd have to look it up. Sean Joyce was the deputy director, and when Comey came on board and retired 30 days later, I don't remember who Comey. Maybe it was McCabe. Maybe it was.
What is your understanding of what happened with Peter Strzok and Lisa Page and the pictures now that were released from the NSA traffic cam in London, which purportedly show Lisa Page and Peter Strzok in, I believe it was in the summer of 2015. I'm not sure the exact dates. They were shown to be in London, but it was clearly from the NSA traffic cams.
I'm unaware of any photographs or videotapes of Strzok and Page in London. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised that they might have been on assignment there, on a temporary assignment for a few days, doing something with British partners. I don't know. I just don't know anything about that.
What is your take on the whole Spygate story as it's being presented night after night, hour after hour on mainstream news and independent news for that matter? Do you think that the Democrats colluded with using the FBI as a political tool to sort of get what they want? Is it possible?
I no, not like that. Let me talk about the deep state for a moment. Let me talk about when forces that might run the government but not be in the government, the kind of thinking, some people bring that up. And really, the deep state is not a thing. It's not an organization. It doesn't have a chief, and it doesn't have a supervisory structure and then minions to go execute. It doesn't have that. The deep state really is a bunch of people who think like each other. And let me tell you, when you go to Washington, and I served many years in Washington, when you go to Washington, within the bureaucracy and without the bureaucracy, on congressional staff and on K Street and the lobbying firms, the big law firms in Washington, the think tanks, what you find is a preponderance of people who went to Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. You can throw in some other schools, maybe Georgetown, Columbia, UPenn, Brown, but a preponderance of people went to Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. You have
Ivy Leagues.
Who went. Well, those three schools primarily. Let me take you back to the 1980s. President Ronald Reagan went to Eureka College in Illinois. So his successor, George H.W. Bush, went to Yale. His successor, Bill Clinton, went to Yale Law School. His successor, George W. Bush, went to Yale Underground, Harvard Business School. And then his successor, Barack Obama, was a graduate of the Harvard Law School. So, and let me tell you something else. In 2012, when Mitt Romney and Barack Obama were running against each other for the White House, when you saw those two men on the debate stage, you were looking at two graduates of the Harvard Law School. So what I'm telling you is that, and now we have our current president is an Ivy League grad, University of Pennsylvania. For those who don't know, it's a private school, not a state school.
Wharton,
University of, so he's an Ivy Leaguer too, but he's not from Princeton, Harvard, Yale, or God forbid Brown. So you have a preponderance of Princeton, Harvard, Yale, and what you have is a conglomeration of people who think alike because they all went to the same schools. Their children all went to the same prep schools. They all know each other through these social circles built around these schools. The same thing in the UK with, Cambridge,
Oxford,
and so what you have cross-Atlantic cross-pollination, Harvard to Cambridge, Yale to Oxford, and some Brit banker's kid goes to Harvard, some Boston banker's kid goes to Oxford. So you have these people that go to the same doggone schools and they run in the same doggone social circles, and so you get people who think the same way about things. And even people who didn't go to those schools but have managed to achieve senior positions, whether it's in commerce or it's in government, have been molded by people who went to Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. And consequently, they all think alike. And what law school did Hillary Clinton graduate from?
Yale Law.
Yale.
Yeah.
Yale Law. So what I'm saying is the deep state isn't an organism. The deep state's a collection of people who think the same way. And that's the same thing if you want to look at the Bilderbergs, any global organization, any gathering in Aspen of, global thinkers, air quoting when I'm saying that. If you look at them, if you look at all of them, you look at their bios, they are all pretty much the same kind of people. And so they think the same way about things. And simply was not possible, in my opinion, for them to fathom that this bombastic, brash guy from Queens, New York City, who's been in the construction and real estate business his entire life. And look, again, love the guy or hate the guy, he inherited $266 million from his father, and instead of being a playboy and messing around the rest of his life spending the money, he turned that into, depending upon who you believe, a $9 or $10 billion fortune. So, a lot of rich kids would just, spend that money they inherited and never do anything productive. He turned $266 million into billions of dollars, and he did it by doing business, and he does business the New York way. Yes. And they couldn't fathom that guy could possibly be elected commander-in-chief. So everything had to be done, and it wasn't, in my opinion, coordinated. There was nobody giving orders. There's no secret message traffic going on. Hey, you really need to do this and do that and make sure that Trump doesn't get elected. It was just a collection of people who think the same way about the same things, and they couldn't fathom Donald Trump getting elected. They had to grease the skids as best as possible for Hillary Clinton. That's my opinion of the deep state, and my opinion of Spygate is that, obviously the Clinton campaign was the one that initially engaged the dossier to be written by the retired MI6 hack. And it was, actually, I think technically it was one of Donald Trump's primary opponents, but it was quickly taken over by the Hillary Clinton campaign, who then paid for it.
That's right. Yeah, $50,000. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course it wasn't the Hillary Clinton campaign. The Hillary Clinton campaign paid a law firm, which then paid a consulting firm on behalf of the campaign, which then paid this, the MI6 retired MI6 hack, and the company that he works for, which name of which escapes me at this moment. But and so the collusion, if there was collusion, it really was within the Clinton campaign, not the Trump campaign.
And when you mentioned the fact that, one person paid the other, paid the other, paid the other, that would make sense because you want the degrees of separation. And going back to the fact that you have 3 decades of, the 1A schools, as we used to call them, because there's top 10 schools and then there's the 1A schools. They all belong in category 1, which would be Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford. Even though Stanford is not part of the Ivy Leagues, in most circles, it is considered the Harvard of the West. So you would think it would just be so easy, since they all think alike. They all think establishment. They all think Harvard is the school that always makes presidents. Yale usually makes Supreme Court justices, that they would be thinking such a way while in school and carry on that same belief. And like you said, when they see an outsider coming in, it's a threat to the way things used to be. It's a threat to the old lobbying in Washington, degreasing the old politicians' pockets. I would think that things might change, and hopefully Donald Trump being president sets a precedent for the future of what is tolerated and what is not tolerated within the Washington circles. Here's something interesting to also talk about is the Trump, when him being not just an outsider, you mentioned the fact that he's a billionaire. A lot of people remember this, but it seems that some people who are arguing that he's only being president because he's trying to benefit down the line. I don't think that having that much money, being this old in his life, which right now makes him the oldest president ever elected, beating Ronald Reagan for that. One of his speeches right before he ran, he makes it clear he does not have to be doing this. He could be living his rest of his days off the money, golfing, building more hotels and casinos, rather than be at the center of tax, essentially all that stress that comes from being president. I always look at the pictures of the presidents going into office and when they leave office, it looks like they didn't age 8 years. They look like they've aged 2 decades. I mean, any single president you look at before and after, you're like, wow, I mean, that's really taken a toll on them. This is something else that someone's been writing me here to ask you about. Now, this is obviously long before you were there, long before anybody was there for that matter, but just something of a myth that maybe you were able to ask someone out of your own curiosity. But when Adolf Hitler allegedly killed himself in 1945, weren't FBI files still tracking him to South America into the 1950s, into Chile or Brazil, Argentina even?
Well, I think the short answer to that is I think is yes. But that to say that the FBI was tracking Adolf Hitler is an inaccurate statement. The FBI was tracking reports of sightings of Adolf Hitler. Those are two different things.
Yeah.
Big, huge different things.
One, you have the guy. The other, you're just catching possible glimpses. Possible is the key word, right?
I mean, I really don't think. Look, nobody wanted their hands on Adolf Hitler more than Joseph Stalin did. And if the Soviet intelligence services couldn't cough up, Adolf Hitler, if he had fled to South America, and not to mention, once Israel was founded in 1947, if the Mossad couldn't find him, so if you have the Soviets, you have the KGB and the Mossad trying to find this guy, he would have been found. He wasn't, because he was dead. So people jump to conclusions when they hear, well, the FBI had files on, tracking Hitler in the 1950s. No. The FBI had files on people reporting sightings of Adolf Hitler in South America in the 1950s. Extremely different things right there. And I'm going to tell you that, between the KGB and the Mossad, if that guy was around, if he was walking planet Earth somewhere, I don't care if it was in the Gobi Desert, they would have put their hands on him and taken great joy in publicly hanging him. But it didn't happen because he was dead in April 1945.
And him of all people, I mean, that is the prize catch. You don't want necessarily a Mengele or Goebbels to take his place. You want the man. So like you said, Mossad, even now, they're still hunting Nazis who are literally on the brink of 100 years old. I think the most recent one was 97, 98 years old, that the Nazi hunters in Israel are still hunting. I know their list is getting really short. But like you said, I would think that, KGB and Mossad searching throughout the world, if it had been in the 50s, of people who may have saw someone who they thought looked like him. Even some people claimed that he had plastic surgery, so what they thought they were looking at was so far attenuated from what he had looked like in 45. I think people may have wanted it to be, as opposed to, like you said, that it's just possible sightings, as opposed to having him tracked, because he would have been hung, I think, on the most public way ever, probably bigger terms than what happened in Nuremberg, because they wouldn't have had him in a group of people for trial. They would have just had him, if that was the case. Now let's talk about what's going on now. what countries or groups within countries, such as ISIS would be a group that I'm referring to, does the U.S. have to worry about now with regards to our own national security? And even within that, I would even ask the sub-question, are cartels considered a threat to our national security? Drug cartels.
Drug cartels are considered a threat to national security because they aren't just moving drugs. They're conducting human smuggling. They're conducting human trafficking. Those are two separate things, by the way. They are moving illicit merchandise of all kinds. This is an example. If somehow the Second Amendment was repealed and firearm ownership was against the law in the United States, you would see the cartels smuggling guns in the United States. They smuggle. Let me say, the two products that follow narcotics internationally as the most trafficked illicit items, you know what those are?
Humans. Right.
Well, human. But in terms of money, what is producing money is exotic animals and artwork. In terms of money associated with international trafficking and smuggling, it's narcotics number one, and it was for a time exotic animals number two, because there are many international controls on how animals can be moved and what animals can be even owned, and then stolen art number three. I think art and animals flip-flop occasionally. So the cartels don't just move drugs; they move other stuff that people want, and they do move people because people do want to buy people. And of course, that's the human trafficking. The human smuggling is the people who want to, make illegal entry into the United States so they can, have a quote better life end quote here. So they move all kinds of merchandise, and because they have their tentacles in so many different things, they're a threat to national security. But they're, in terms of the global threats to our nation that are out there, it's not high on the list because it's considered, a criminal organization that does not have the capability to destabilize the republic. Terrorism, of course, terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the many others that are around the world, the radical Islamist jihadi terrorist organizations are threats to the national security, but I think we have to be realistic when we assess terrorist threats, is that no terrorist group in the world can bring down the American Republic. Simply cannot happen. They don't have the gravity, don't have the power, they don't have the capability. They can inflict casualties, they can inflict damage, but they can't take down the Republic. So when somebody says terrorism is an existential threat, I disagree vehemently, because no terrorist organization can cause the fall of the Republic. The greatest threats to national security are nation states that can cause the downfall of the Republic by attacking us, fighting a war with us, and beating us. And I think, and this comes from my, many years as a reserve military officer, as well as my years of service in the national security arena, is that we have been fighting wars against countries and groups which are our, how would I say, not exactly powerhouses of military capability. Fighting Iraq is not the same as fighting China.
Yeah,
and
or Russia even.
Or Russia even. And we have not had a peer or near-peer competitor war since World War II, really. Now, Korea came close because the Chinese involved themselves in it, and we were successful in at least regaining ground in the 38th parallel when the armistice was signed. Vietnam, we had no intention. I mean, we basically were there to prop up the South Vietnamese regime to fight the spread of communism, but it wasn't a war that we went into to, quote, win. we just recycled people in, for one-year cures over and over and over again, as many people have said. One general in particular, we didn't fight Vietnam for 10 years. We fought Vietnam 1 year 10 times the way it was done.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, but we never, if you really read like A Bright Shining Light, a book by Neil Sheehan, a great book and very lengthy, we never intended to actually win. It was always hopeful that the Viet Cong would come to the negotiating table and the South Vietnamese regime would be spared. We never understood that Ho Chi Minh and his people were going to reunify that country, and that nationalism was more important than communism. And so we haven't fought, a Germany or a Japan since World War II. Now we're looking at China, we're looking at Russia. India right now is our friend, but make no mistake, India is a huge global power. Not on the scale of the United States for sure, not on the scale of China for sure, but with vast resources. And so the Chinese and the Indians don't get along too well. But we're looking at going into a future in which our national security is, might be challenged by certainly communist China, and we had better be prepared to fight a peer competitor. Because China is rapidly becoming a peer competitor, certainly a near peer competitor now. And I think those are the greatest threats to our national security. You do have rogue regimes, and I haven't even started about Iran or Iran, as I was told to call it. But that's another huge threat.
And that is something I want to ask you about in a moment. Speaking about China, on top of the fact that you have this enormous population, and even though they may be poor on the outskirts of their cities, the majority of the country as a whole, the number of people they have, and then the whole idea that they've been stealing our technology, for instance, plans on how to make our advanced fighters, or after we had crashed a stealth bomber or stealth fighter, you just always hear of them getting our research and development essentially from hackers. And so if you don't have your technology to be essentially ahead of a country, and you're literally playing a fair game, well, then that's when one country that has the population triple the size of, say, the army of the other, or much even larger than that, you would definitely have to weigh that factor in, because if you both have the same technology or access to the same technology, then you will have a war that we've never seen before. And the fact that you mentioned Vietnam, and even that we've had the Persian Gulf, Desert Storm, and more recently Operation Iraqi Freedom, even these so-called wars aren't conventional wars, because we've never had a declaration of war by Congress. Isn't that correct? Since 45.
That's correct, yeah.
Now, how would that change, or would have changed, the last, say, 3 wars, if you counted, Vietnam, again, like you mentioned, that was more of a support. But let's just talk about when we went to defend Kuwait, the first Persian Gulf, Desert Storm. If Congress declared war, what would have changed fundamentally with how we approached it? Would have given the military more broad powers to kill Saddam Hussein in the 90s as opposed to the second time around, or would have nothing have changed?
Well, I think that the military performed, in a most excellent way in the Persian Gulf War. I mean, a 100-hour ground war. The way air power and precision munitions were leveraged, and it was just brilliant. How it would have changed, just a declaration of war is a declaration by Congress that the country is all in, and all of the national resources would have been leveraged, and I could really only see what the result would have been, the reduction of the Iraqi regime to ashes, and the takeover of the country, which was not the objective at the time. Obviously, it would just have merely changed what the objective would have been. I don't think that Shield Desert Storm known as the Persian Gulf War, required a declaration of war. But when the Congress does that, it says we're all in. The entire country's in, every bit of it. And all factors, all levers of national power are now leveraged through this effort.
One of the things you may agree with me is something that I've heard that I think is absolutely the case. When it regards to Operation Desert Storm or Desert Shield, one of the reasons we were so great in it is because you had a lot of the Vietnam vets who were defeated by us ending that war with so many American casualties, that those who had stayed in the military that eventually became career officers, you sort of had that thorn in them where they felt like they had a loss in the 60s and 70s and had a chance to redeem themselves in the eyes of the public. And I believe that's one of the motivating factors to go and show the world, hey, look, our U.S. military is still the greatest in the world, and look how fast we can defeat this oppressor nation, and look how great our technology is for precision guidance bombings, and how we can minimize the casualties of the civilians, and literally having the what do they call it, that sort of like that lightning, do you recall shock and awe? I know that was labeled in the second time we went back, but by using the shock and awe tactics of just one night, you see all these American ships in the Persian Gulf, aircraft carriers getting ready, and then next night you have all these Tomahawks landing at the same time all over Baghdad and wherever Saddam's troops were in Kuwait at the time. And you also have everyone else doing their part in attacking. So if there are fighters in the air, then you have the fighters. If you have the bombers, you have the bombers. But it just seemed like everything was coordinated to give the impression to the world that we can still perform the same way that we performed in World War II to be the world's greatest leader. So did you think the fact that you had a lot of these Vietnam vets in the early war of the Iraq Desert Shield and Desert Storm that played such a factor in the morale amongst the troops that were being guided by these former Vietnam vets?
I think so, but I have a somewhat different angle on that perspective, and that's that it really wasn't viewed as a chance to redeem themselves, but when the generals who had been lieutenants, captains, and majors in Vietnam were planning this thing, I think they made it clear to the national leadership, and of course at the time was George H.W. Bush, who was a combat veteran himself of World War II, that we're not going to do this the way we did it in Vietnam, because we didn't, we meaning the leadership at the time in Vietnam, political leadership especially, didn't allow the military to fight in Vietnam in a way that would have brought any kind of victory. And so their planning and how the war was fought was done to ensure that there would be a win, because they weren't going to fight it. I mean, just give you an example. I weren't on radio. I could bring this guy's name up immediately, but the 3-star Air Force general, who was the air component commander at CENTCOM during the Persian Gulf War. He flew F-105s in Vietnam, and there was a particularly bad day in 1965 in which 7 F-105s were shot down, and he vowed that he would, never, if he was ever a general, ever send people to die so stupidly. And so, the planning, when the generals were planning it, they were going to plan, they wanted the least amount of political interference. They didn't want Washington telling them which targets to choose. They were going to choose targets based on their military value, not because, some staffer in the White House, thinks it might be good or bad to target a specific position, as happened during the Vietnam War. And I think it was the fact that they decided they were going to do it the right way, not the wrong way, which was the way they experienced it as junior officers.
Were you referring to General Norman Schwarzkopf?
No, he was the overall commander. He was the 4-star in overall command. I'm talking about his right hand for air warfare, the 3-star Air Force general. Can't remember his name. Who became a 4-star himself, but I can't remember the guy's name. So not Norman Schwarzkopf. No. He was the overall command. He was the big.
Yeah.
He was the big cheese.
Stormin' Norman. That's what I remember him as.
Stormin' Norman.
Yeah. Now let's talk about Iran, because this is definitely something that's in the news. Just the other day, I was talking to someone who was my Uber driver, actually, and he was here from Iran, and I didn't go into that much detail from him about the Iran nuclear deal, and I would think that would be a good place for us to start talking about to lead up to what happened. But essentially, this is what I got from him, that despite his country having this nuclear deal with the United States, the population hated it, and the population hates that the regime is trying to keep their population suppressed to the way they used to be, whereas really they welcome Western technology. That's at least what he gave me as a young 25-year-old man that had been here literally for a couple years, that he said is what the population is feeling. So let's backtrack for a second and talk about this horrific nuclear the Iran nuclear deal that Obama had signed with Iran that Trump recently got out of.
Well, I think my reading of course, I have not reviewed all the documents. I'm just going off of what I've read in the press during the Obama administration when that agreement was signed. I remember reading a passage that how many gas centrifuges Iran would be allowed to operate under this agreement. And having worked several years in the WMD world, I almost fell out of my chair, because to me it would merely accelerate their drive to enrich uranium and to actually construct a device. And I was shaking. I mean, I remember reading the passage. I don't remember the number right now, but I remember reading the passage and thinking to myself, "This is nuts. They're giving it away to Iran." I'm from Texas, so we say Iran. So I'm going to just say Iran.
By all means.
Iran.
Yeah.
But we're giving it away to Iran. We're just giving it away. This whole agreement, just giving it away. I remember thinking that and shaking my head, going, just what the hell?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a good thing that we have pulled out, but we have to remember that there's a substantial amount of damage done by signing that agreement. It's all of that cash money that was shuttled over to Tehran, which is worthy of a show in itself to talk about that. But and somebody more knowledgeable of it than I to talk about it. But all of that money just enriched their coffers for military and terrorist programs and their quest for a nuclear weapon, and then of course the lack of any kind of inspecting regime. The inspection regime, as I understand it in that agreement, is that the Iranians will tell us which facilities we can inspect and when we can inspect them. Well, I can clean out the barn, pretty good, and have somebody come look at it, look how clean it is, and the next day it's back to normal with
stock it up again, yeah.
Hay and horse manure. It's like that's not an inspection regime at all. That's just for show. And so that was, in my opinion, a very, very bad agreement. It boggles my mind, especially after the New York Times, in the New York Times magazine came out, the Obama national security staffer, he was on the National Security Council. I think he was the deputy national security advisor, a young guy, novelist before he got on with the Obama administration, whose brother was president of CBS News. So I'm laying these markers out. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was interviewed for a lengthy article, and basically he crowed about what a snow job it was on the American people. But still, You don't get any kind of coverage from mainstream media on that, and especially not now because it's bashed Trump at every opportunity, whether he needs it or not or deserves it or not. But that was a very bad deal. Iran is a bad actor regionally and globally, and it's a real threat. Now, it's true, and we've seen it recently, the riots in Tehran when they were chanting death to the dictator instead of death to America. Very telling that the population wants to be out from under this radical Islamist yoke. But like all organisms of power, is a dictator or a despot or a despotic regime, what is its number one purpose? It's to protect itself. That's its number one purpose. And then everything else that they're in favor of doing comes after protecting oneself. That's why bad regimes have secret police, and political police to ensure the regime stays in power. No different in Iran. And there's also a center of... Go ahead. I'll let you...
Oh, no. I was just going to say, I would think that some of the people in the power there would probably think how stupid of our Obama administration for giving them the nuclear toys, and how far behind we have been by letting him have these years to get that much closer. And I can't even imagine how anyone in the Obama administration would be so stupid as to think, okay, if they're only letting us inspect on days they want to in areas that they want to, and we know that they have been an enemy of the United States going back decades, even through the end of the Carter administration, where they still had our hostages. Why would anyone in the White House or any advisor to Obama say, okay, let's just let them enrich uranium for their own power plants, but yet the end goal is for them to have weapons? It just boggles my mind how people, in our government can be so stupid. It never makes any sense to me. That's the part that I think I'm always boggled about.
Yeah, well, I think that comes down to the difference between how there are no classical liberals anymore in our society. I mean, they're very few and far between. Like Senator Scoop Jackson and people like that. They're gone. The Democratic Party is a leftist party, so it's really a difference, in my opinion, about how conservatives and leftists view the world. Conservatives view the world in terms of, what outcomes. What outcomes are wanted? Do you want to achieve? So what are we going to do to achieve those outcomes? And leftists view the world not in terms of outcomes, but in terms of intentionality. Are intentions good? Because if your intentions are good, then the other side will see how good your intentions are, and it will influence them to change for the better. Well, I think that anybody who knows both human nature and human history knows that doesn't work. It's never worked. Ever work. It doesn't work often in personal relationships, and it certainly doesn't work in the hard realities of global, realpolitik, and the hard reality of geopolitics. It simply doesn't work. So outcomes weren't on the radar screen. It was about intentions and trying to influence a good turn rather than demand certain outcomes. I think it's really just one of political philosophy and really a philosophy, one's philosophy and viewpoint on the world.
And now we're actually seeing them obviously complaining like children with these sanctions. And I heard that when the next sanctions kick in, I would think that they would fold. I think they're bluffing, and I think that they can't even contain the anger of their own people. And so at that point, they would just give in. And it's kind of stupid how our president offered a meeting with no conditions, something he didn't even offer North Korea, and they flat out turned it away. I don't know. It just basic principles or just common sense goes to show that why would you do that? Why would you turn down a meeting with a country, an organization, or anybody who's hindering your own population and your own wallet? Just again, against common sense. I do want to spend a quick moment, since we are getting close to the end of time, to talk about where people can find you. I know you're all over the media as a commentator. I do know that you finished, or you closed your firm down, but let's talk about where people can find you. You have any websites, any books, or anything else available?
Well, I don't have any books available. I have one website that's currently online, and it is I do technical advising right now for a mystery writer and for hire for theatrical productions, television shows, movies, writers, novelists, and things like that. And you can find me at xfedproductions.com, and that is X, the letter X, FED, XFED Productions, xfedproductions.com. And if somebody were to Google my name, I'd come up all over Google, and they can find me easily that way.
Well, I knew this would happen, Colonel, that we would get too close to having not going through so many different issues. And as you mentioned throughout the show, and so did I, that there are so many different topics that we could have done entire shows on, which obviously I know I have to bring you back. Everybody, I truly hoped you enjoyed our chat with former Special Agent Todd Halsey, or Colonel Todd Halsey of the FBI, and also that his time he worked as an FBI agent for the CIA, and his insights into his time as working as a U.S. Customs agent, and so much more information our Colonel has known. And folks, be sure to catch this replay when it plays in the United Kingdom on Deprogrammed Radio Network and Pulse Talk Radio Network, and of course PSN and Paranormal King. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J, host of Dr. J Radio Live, and we are officially signing off for the night.